On the morning of October 3rd, 2023, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Callaway County, Meredith State, looked down from the bench at four people who had spent the better part of a decade treating their neighbors like a personal savings account. Then he looked at me. I am 68 years old. I weigh 119 pounds. I taught 7th grade English at Fenwick Hollow Middle School for 32 years before I retired. I still grade things in red pen. I still alphabetize my spice cabinet. The judge said, "Mrs. Aldrin, the documentation you compiled and submitted to this court over an 11-year period represents one of the most thorough, organized, and legally precise records of sustained community fraud I have encountered in 24 years on this bench. The prosecution's case was built on your foundation." The lead defendant, Board Treasurer Gerald Monk, was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. His co-counsel had stopped writing. The court reporter's fingers paused on the keys for just a moment. Judge Harlan sentenced Gerald Monk to 11 years in federal prison. His co-defendants, Constance Draper, Philip Alt, and Renee Bosco, received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years each. Combined, the four sitting members of the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association Board were ordered to pay $3.1 million in restitution to the 241 households in our community, plus $1.2 million in civil damages, plus the full cost of the federal investigation, $3.1 million. From a homeowners association in a quiet subdivision in a mid-sized city most people couldn't find on a map. From the same four people who at a board meeting in March of 2015 responded to my first formal set of financial questions by suggesting, with smiles on their faces, in front of 62 of our neighbors, that I was still adjusting after losing Warren, and that they would always be happy to walk me through anything that seemed confusing. I had been taking notes for 2 years by then. I had 9 more to go. I want to tell this story in order, because order is how you win. Not by going public first, not by posting on neighborhood forums, not by making accusations before you have the floor. You win by reading everything they give you, writing down everything they say, yet in staying exactly as quiet as they think you are, until the exact moment that silence turns into a federal criminal case. My name is Eleanor Aldrin. My late husband, Warren, and I bought our home at 14 Birchwood Terrace, Sycamore Ridge, in April of 2007. Planned community: 241 single-family homes, a common pool, a small playground, a clubhouse with a perpetually broken air conditioner, and an HOA fee of $310 per month. For that, you got landscaping in the common areas, snow removal, access to the pool, and the privilege of asking permission before you repainted your shutters. Warren died of a stroke in January of 2012. He was 61 years old. We had been in the house less than 5 years. I was 57, still teaching full-time, and suddenly living alone in a house we had bought assuming we would grow old in together. 6 days after his funeral, I received a condolence card from the Sycamore Ridge HOA board. It was signed by all 4 of them. Gerald Monk had drawn a small cross next to his name, which I thought was a peculiar thing to do. I would later find out that within 10 days of Warren's death, the board had approved, at an unannounced emergency session, with no resident notice, citing a maintenance emergency provision in the bylaws, a special assessment of $800 per household for urgent pool infrastructure repair. The pool's infrastructure was fine. I had been in it the previous August. I didn't know about that session yet. I wouldn't know for another 14 months. But I will tell you this. Some things announce themselves quietly. You don't hear them, you feel them. I didn't start looking because I suspected anything specific. I started looking because I was a teacher. 32 years of reading student papers, trains you to notice when the conclusion doesn't follow from the evidence. You don't always know what's wrong. You just know something doesn't add up. The HOA distributed annual financial disclosures every October. I had received them since 2007 and filed them without much thought because Warren had handled our household finances, and I had, frankly, trusted that community governance was reasonably competent. After Warren died, I started reading everything myself. In October of 2012, I sat down at my kitchen table with the Sycamore Ridge HOA Annual Financial Report for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2012. And then I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the 2011 report and the 2010 report and laid all three side by side. The reserve fund, the account HOAs maintained for major future expenses, had been $487,000 in the 2010 report. In 2011, it was $412,000. In 2012, it was $339,000. That was a $148,000 decline in 2 years. No major repair work had occurred that I was aware of. The pool was still the pool. The entry gate still stuck. The clubhouse still had the same stained ceiling tiles. The expenditure section of the 2012 report listed something called Common Area Infrastructure and Maintenance Services, $121,400. I walked the entire community that weekend. I took photographs on my phone. The only visible maintenance work anywhere was a fresh coat of paint on the entrance sign and some new mulch around the mailbox island. Neither of those things costs $121,400. I emailed Gerald Monk on a Monday morning and asked, politely, for copies of the vendor invoices supporting the infrastructure expenditure line. He replied the same day. The response was warm and entirely unhelpful. He explained that detailed vendor documentation was internal operational material that the board maintained for audit purposes but did not routinely distribute to residents, and that I was welcome to attend the next board meeting if I had further questions. I already knew he was wrong about the documentation. Section 9, Article 6 of Sycamore Ridge's CC&Rs, which I had read in full for the first time the previous week, stated that any homeowner in good standing could request financial records related to HOA expenditures within 10 business days of written notice. I sent the written notice, certified mail, return receipt requested. 12 business days passed. Nothing arrived. I sent a second notice. This one cited Section 9, Article 6 by exact name, quoted the relevant language, and noted the date of my original request. Gerald Monk called me on a Thursday evening. He was pleasant. He said records were being compiled and that the board operated on volunteer time and that he would get me something as soon as the documents were organized. He used the phrase "as soon as we can" twice. I thanked him for the call. I hung up the phone. I wrote down the exact words he used, the time of the call, 7:22 p.m., and the date. Then I drove to Callaway County's big box office supply store and bought a 4-drawer filing cabinet and a box of hanging folders. I labeled the first folder, Sycamore Ridge HOA, Unanswered Requests 2012. I want to pause here because I've thought a great deal about whether I waited too long. 2 years of building files before I said anything publicly. 9 years before I went to federal authorities. Reasonable people disagree sharply on whether that patience was a virtue or a failure. I'm not going to pretend I've resolved that question. But I will tell you what I decided at the time and why. In January of 2013, I submitted my first public records request to Callaway County's Office of Permits and Licensing. I asked for all building permits, contractor work orders, and filed maintenance records associated with Sycamore Ridge's common areas between 2007 and 2012. The county responded within 3 weeks. Total permitted and filed work on Sycamore Ridge common areas from 2007 through 2012, $38,700. The HOA's own financial disclosures reported $334,000 in infrastructure and maintenance expenditures during the same period. That was a gap of approximately $295,000. I understood, as a non-financial professional, that not all maintenance required permits. Cosmetic work, minor landscaping, small interior repairs. So I did not assume that the full gap was fraud. I was methodical. I was a teacher. I documented the discrepancy and looked for a reasonable explanation before I drew conclusions. The reasonable explanation did not materialize. Instead, I found a company called Crestland Property Management and Maintenance, LLC. It appeared in the HOA's summary records as the primary maintenance vendor, having received payments totaling over $240,000 between 2009 and 2012. I looked up Crestland Property Management and Maintenance, LLC, in the Callaway County Business Registry. It had been formed in November of 2008. Its registered agent was Philip Olt, HOA board member, facilities liaison, the man who had smiled warmly at my husband's funeral. I sat with that for a long time. Then I opened a second filing cabinet drawer and labeled it Vendor Conflict of Interest, Evidence to Date. The March 2015 board meeting was a turning point, though not in the way the board intended. By that point, I had 18 months of county public records, 2 years of cross-referenced financial reports, and a growing log of unanswered document requests. I attended the annual meeting with a typed list of 7 specific questions, formatted exactly the way I used to format writing prompts for my students. Clear, sequential, each one requiring a specific factual answer. I asked Gerald Monk to explain the relationship between the HOA's maintenance contracts and Crestland Property Management and Maintenance, LLC. I asked whether the board had disclosed to residents that a board member held a financial interest in a vendor receiving HOA payments. I asked for the total amount paid to Crestland since its formation and the specific work performed in exchange. Constance Draper, the board secretary, leaned forward and said, "Eleanor, we know you've been going through a difficult adjustment since Warren passed, and we genuinely appreciate your concern for the community. These financial structures are genuinely complex, and there's regulatory language involved that can be easy to misread. We're always here if you need help understanding how it works." Philip All nodded. Renee Bosco looked at her hands. 62 neighbors were in that room. 3 of them did not look away. One was a woman named Dorinda, a retired IRS examiner who lived on Sycamore Court and had been attending board meetings longer than I had. The second was a man named Carl, who had worked in commercial real estate for 25 years before relocating to Sycamore Ridge after his divorce. The third was a younger woman, mid-30s, named Justine, who was a paralegal at a firm that handled insurance litigation. After the meeting, in the parking lot, the 4 of us stood in the cold for 45 minutes. Carl said, "The Crestline payments are in the summary reports, but there are no corresponding line items anywhere in the approved budgets." I went back 5 years. Dorinda said, "I pulled the IRS exemption filings. The HOA has been claiming reserve fund balances that don't match what's in the state-required disclosures." Justine said, "That's a federal reporting issue." None of us raised our voices. None of us made promises we couldn't keep. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to share what we had individually gathered before deciding on any next step. I drove home and labeled a new drawer, Collaborative Documentation, Phase 2. What followed was 5 years of work I will compress without minimizing. Dorinda had tax documentation experience that I didn't. She analyzed the HOA's annual 990 filings, the nonprofit tax returns filed with the IRS, and identified systematic underreporting of reserve fund distributions beginning in 2009. The discrepancy between what the HOA reported to the IRS and what it reported to residents was not a rounding error. It was a pattern. Carl had access to commercial real estate databases. He pulled comparable maintenance contracts for HOA communities of similar size across Meredith State. The average cost for the scope of work Kreslin invoiced for was between 60 and 70% lower than what the HOA had paid. Not 10% over market, not 20. Between 60 and 70% for years, consistently. Justine navigated the legal filings. In 2016, she helped us draft a formal complaint to the Meredith State HOA Oversight Authority, citing specific provisions of the Meredith Planned Community Act, Section 14-3180, which governed fiduciary obligations of HOA board members and explicitly prohibited self-dealing vendor arrangements without full disclosure and resident vote. The state reviewed the complaint. An examiner came out. The board produced amended records that had clearly been modified from the originals I had been denied in 2012 and 2013. The state examiner found administrative record-keeping deficiencies and issued a non-binding corrective guidance memo. The board distributed a letter to all 241 households announcing that the state had reviewed their records and found the HOA in compliance. Gerald Monk hand-delivered a copy to my mailbox. I filed it under Board Communications, Misrepresentations. In the spring of 2017, we retained an attorney. Her name was Angela Tran, and she had practiced HOA and property law in Callaway County for 14 years. I paid her initial retainer, $4,500, from savings I had been setting aside since I retired. Money from years of teaching. Money from the life I had shared with Warren. Angela filed a civil suit. Aldrin, Holt, Patterson, and Whitmore versus Sycamore Ridge HOA Board of Directors in Callaway County Superior Court. The stated purpose was discovery. Legal compulsion to produce the full financial records the board had been withholding for 5 years. The board hired 3 attorneys and filed a motion to dismiss. The motion argued that the plaintiffs lacked standing, that the financial records were protected under operational confidentiality provisions, and I want you to hear this carefully, that the primary plaintiff was engaged in what it called a grief-driven campaign of community disruption, rooted in the destabilizing loss of a spouse and manifesting as unfounded financial allegations. They filed that language in a legal document in Callaway County Superior Court. I read it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night. I did not cry. I underlined the phrase. I photographed the filing. I forwarded it to Angela with a 1-sentence email. They are frightened. Let's proceed. The motion to dismiss failed. In the fall of 2017, the court ordered full financial disclosure. What arrived at Angela's office over the next 3 weeks, 19 banker boxes, took us 6 months to fully process. Here's what we found. Kreslin Property Management and Maintenance, LLC had received $847,000 in HOA payments between 2009 and 2019. Of that, Angela's forensic accounting consultant documented $681,000 in payments attached to either fabricated invoices, dramatically inflated invoices, or invoices duplicating work performed simultaneously by legitimate licensed contractors at a fraction of the cost. Bank subpoenas, obtained through discovery, showed Kreslin's operating account making direct transfers to personal accounts held by Philip Alt and Gerald Monk. not business accounts, personal checking accounts, alts in Meredith State, and monks in an account registered at a bank headquartered in Prescott State, across the state line. That second point matters. I'll come back to it. Constance Draper's arrangement was different. A vendor called Northview Administrative Services had received $178,000 over 8 years for what the HOA described as administrative support and clerical management services. The vendor was real. The invoices described real services, filing, communications, record-keeping, but the rates were fabricated. Northview Administrative Services charged the HOA between 4 and 6 times its standard rates for identical clients, and the company was registered to Constance Draper's adult daughter. Renee Bosco had handled the community's annual events budget, the summer block party, the holiday decorating, the welcome packages for new residents. Between 2009 and 2020, that budget had been approved by the board at a total of $247,000. Vendor invoices produced in Discovery showed actual event costs of $61,000. The remaining $186,000 had been processed through a vendor called Sycamore Community Events Group, which was registered to Renee Bosco's husband, and which had no clients other than Sycamore Ridge HOA. Total documented misappropriation, $3.1 million. Over 11 years, from 241 households. Some of those families were young, first-time homeowners making exactly the kind of hopeful investment Warren and I had made in 2007. Some were elderly and on fixed incomes. A retired postal worker 2 streets over from me had quietly refinanced his home in 2018 to cover rising HOA fees and a property tax increase in the same year. When I found that out later, I thought about him for a long time. Angela flagged something in the bank records that changed the scope of everything. Gerald Monk's transfers to his Prescott State account had crossed state lines. Under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, the Federal Wire Fraud Statute, wire transmissions used to execute a scheme to defraud constitute a federal criminal offense, regardless of whether the underlying fraud occurs entirely within one state. When wire fraud is involved, your case stops being a county civil matter. It becomes a matter for the FBI. Angela submitted a formal referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in April of 2019. I prepared a supplementary evidence package, my 11 years of documentation, organized into 5 binders, totaling 1,042 pages, and submitted it alongside the referral. The assigned case agent called me in July of 2019. He had read everything. He said, and I wrote this down verbatim, "Mrs. Aldrin, in 16 years doing this work, it is uncommon to receive a private citizen's documentation at this level of organization. You have essentially handed us a roadmap." The federal investigation ran quietly and in parallel to our civil case for the next 3 years. The board did not know. Gerald Monk circulated his quarterly newsletter. Constance Draper organized the annual holiday potluck. Philip Alt attended community events. Renee Bosco emailed residents about parking policy. And every quarter, I attended the HOA board meeting. I sat in the 3rd row, center seat. I took notes on a legal pad. I said nothing that indicated what was coming. People ask me how I did that. How I sat in a room with those 4 people for years, knowing what I knew. And my honest answer is this. Teaching taught me that the most important skill in any confrontation isn't how loud you can be. It's how long you can wait for the exact right moment. I had been practicing that skill for 3 decades before I ever needed it here. Some of my former students would recognize exactly what I was doing. On a Tuesday morning in the first week of September 2022, federal agents executed simultaneous arrest warrants at the homes of Gerald Monk, Constance Draper, Philip Alt, and Renee Bosco. All four were arrested before 8 a.m. Dorinda called me at 7:51. She said, "It happened, Eleanor." I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had read the 2012 financial report, the same table where I had read the legal filing with the phrase about grief-driven disruption. I stood there for a moment without moving. Then I sat down. I made tea. I thought about Warren, not in a sad way. In the quiet way you think about someone when something they would have cared about has finally come through. He was a careful man. He would have appreciated the patience. He would have made a note of the date. I called Dorinda back, then Carl, then Justine. We were on the phone together for a long time without saying very much. The federal trial opened in June of 2023. I testified for 2.5 days. The prosecutor asked me first about my background. I told her what I've told you. Retired 7th grade English teacher. No financial training, no legal background. Professional skills. Reading carefully, organizing information, asking questions that didn't get answered the first time. She asked when I first suspected fraud. I told her I hadn't suspected fraud initially. I told her I had read the annual report and found that numbers didn't match. I told her I had asked for clarification and been told not to worry about it. She asked what I did when I was told not to worry about it. I said I worried about it. Methodically and with documentation. The defense spent most of the second day on cross-examination. They suggested I had a personal motive rooted in bereavement. They suggested I had organized Dorinda, Carl, and Justine into a coordinated harassment effort against community volunteers. They suggested my documentation was selectively compiled to support a conclusion I had reached before examining the evidence. Judge Harlan interrupted at one point and asked the defense counsel directly whether they intended to contest the authenticity of the bank transfer records. They said they did not. He asked whether they intended to contest the authenticity of the IRS 990 filings. They did not. He asked whether they intended to contest the vendor registration documents linking board members to recipient companies. They did not. The defense counsel said they were contesting the interpretation of those documents. The judge said, "I see, you may continue." The jury deliberated for 14 hours across 2 days. On October 3, 2023, all 4 defendants were found guilty on all counts. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, mail fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1341, conspiracy to commit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and, for Monk specifically, money laundering. The sentencing was 3 weeks later. I sat in the second row. I had a legal pad in my bag out of habit. I didn't open it. Gerald Monk read a statement. He said he regretted the impact on the community. He said decisions had been made under financial pressure and that things had escalated beyond his intentions. He said he had always believed he was acting in the community's best interest. Judge Harlan listened to the entire statement without interrupting. Then he said the evidence demonstrated a calculated, deliberate, and sustained theft executed by 4 individuals who used their positions of community trust to extract millions of dollars from their neighbors over more than a decade, including deliberate increases in special assessments timed to maximize extraction during periods when residents were least likely to scrutinize board decisions. He sentenced Gerald Monk to 11 years in federal prison. Constance Draper, 7 years. Philip Alt, 8 years. Renee Bosco, 5 years plus 24 months of supervised release. Combined restitution, $3.1 million to the 241 households of Sycamore Ridge, distributed according to years of residency and total fees paid, plus $1.2 million in civil damages, plus full reimbursement of investigation costs. I received a restitution check 11 months later for $22,400. I used $14,000 of it to establish a small fund at Fenwick Hollow Middle School, my old school, specifically for students in financial need who couldn't afford field trips, supplies, or extracurricular participation fees. The remaining $8,400 I gave to the retired postal worker on Maple Street, whose name was Harold, in cash in an envelope with a note that said only, "You were owed this." He stood at his door for a moment and didn't say anything. Then he said, "How long did you know?" I said, "About 7 years." He shook his head slowly. Then he laughed, not a bitter laugh. Something more complicated. I want to be honest about what winning felt like, because I think people expect something cleaner. It was good. It was genuinely, deeply satisfying in ways I'm not going to downplay for the sake of modesty. 11 years, the legal filing about grief-driven disruption. Being told, in front of my neighbors, that I probably didn't understand complex financial structures. 11 years of that. Resolved in a federal courtroom by a judge who called my binders the foundation of the case. Yes, that felt good. But here is what I will also tell you. Gerald Monk and Constance Draper and Philip Alt and Renee Bosco were not the whole problem. They were opportunists who found a structure that enabled them. The HOA system, 370,000 associations across this country, most of them operating under minimal external oversight, governed by boards of self-selected volunteers with enormous financial authority and very little accountability. That structure is unchanged. I receive emails regularly now, from people in communities I've never heard of, in states I've never visited, describing patterns that sound familiar, the line items that don't match the work, the requests for documentation that never receive a response, the gentle suggestions that they're confused. And here is what I want to say to those people, to anyone who has been told they're too emotional, too inexperienced, too recently bereaved to understand what's being done to them. You do not need a law degree. You do not need a financial background. You need to read what they give you. You need to file your requests in writing, certified, with return receipt. You need to write down the date and time and exact words of every conversation. And you need to refuse, quietly, patiently, completely, to let them make you feel small for asking questions. That is the whole strategy. I did it for 11 years on a teacher's organizational habits and a very good filing cabinet. I think about Warren sometimes when I'm updating the spreadsheet I keep of the emails I receive from people in similar situations. He would have found the whole thing fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. He was a history teacher. He believed the only antidote to institutional corruption was an educated, persistent, literate citizenry. I was a 7th grade English teacher. I believed in sentences. Specific, documented, unambiguous sentences. Turns out we were both right. If something in this story resonated with you, if you've been sitting on a financial report you don't quite understand, or a record request that went unanswered, or a meeting where someone smiled and told you not to worry, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. You are not alone in this. And you are almost certainly not as confused as they want you to think you are. This is HOA Nightmares. New stories every week. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. These stories don't end the way the people in power expect them to. Take care of yourselves. Read the fine print, file the request, and keep the receipts.